Fiona and welcome to part 2 of the corset top tutorial. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I will link it down below where I make the same corset but out of like fabric and boning and things that I bought. In this tutorial, I wanted to use something that everyone might have laying around their house to make it a little bit easier, especially during quarantine times. What you're gonna need for this is some ribbon or shoelace to lace up the back of your corset. You'll need some zip ties, which are easy enough to get off Amazon, or you might have some already in your house, which is awesome. You'll need 2 t-shirts, one for the outer part and one for the lining, or you can make it reversible, which would also be really cool. You also need the corset top pattern that I made in part 1 if you want to go back to that video and watch it and learn how to make it. I added on seam allowance in this video because I forgot to add seam allowance, so you'll see that here. Also, if you don't have pattern paper to make your corset pattern, you can use some wrapping paper as well, and since Christmas is just around the corner, you might have some on hand. Alright, so that should be everything for me, and let's get into it. Alright everyone, we're going to start by adding our seam allowance to the pattern, which I didn't do in part 1. We're going to start with our 3 pattern pieces, the front bodice, the back piece, and then the part that goes under our armpit. Here I'm adding about 5/8 of an inch of seam allowance. I'm only going to be doing it on this one side since this is going to be where I am connecting the front bodice piece to that curved underarm piece. So here are the final 3 pieces with the seam allowance added. I apologize that you didn't get to see the other 2 pieces getting the seam allowance added, but I lost a bunch of footage in the process of editing this video. But it's pretty straightforward. You just add your seam allowance to where you're going to be placing the pieces together. Now this is the shirt that I'm going to be using. It's a pretty simple thermal shirt, I guess a pajama shirt you could call it, but it's a little bit stretchy, and later in the video you see I didn't take into account that while doing my seam allowance and the size of my pattern pieces, so definitely make sure to take into account that during your project. And then for my lining, I'm going to be using another plain cotton t-shirt. This one I think he had just gotten from H&M a couple years ago, so it's just a good way for to upcycle simple items that you have. So I began by cutting off both of the arms on the shirt. That's going to be used later for some of our longer pieces like our straps and binding. And then I flipped the shirt right side out and I began placing my pattern pieces. I placed the front bodice piece on the fold of the side of the shirt right under the armpit, so I can get one full piece that's fully symmetrical in the front. And then I just placed my other 2 pieces as close as possible to that so I don't waste any fabric. I did repeat this on the other cotton t-shirt, but unfortunately I did lose footage, so I can't show you guys that in this video, but it's the same process. I put the front bodice piece on the fold underneath the armpit and follow all the same steps. So you should have already seen the pattern cutting part, but I just want to show you what everything looks like pinned together. Everything's gonna get just a straight stitch right down, and I think I'm going to do a, I think I gave a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So we're just going to, I find pinning is easiest for the rounded edge because it can be a bit finicky, but really the rest you don't have to pin unless you're a little bit nervous about it being lopsided. But I like to pin because I'm definitely not an expert and I might mess it up. So So here are all the pieces sewn together, and I'm just trying to decide whether or not I want to make it into more of a tank top corset. I'll insert an image here somewhere as like what I'm thinking. I've seen some really cool reworked Nike vintage stuff in this kind of style, so I think I might try that, kind of change it up a little bit, do some spaghetti straps. It could be fun. So here I'm just kind of guesstimating what the shape that I want the top part of my spaghetti straps to be. So I kind of just drew a triangle that led up from my neckline, so it was still kind of cohesive, and then I cut it out, and to make it even more symmetrical with the other side, I folded the top over so both sides would be exactly the same. Now, once I felt like my sides were symmetrical, I started pinning them right sides together, and I'm going to sew with a straight stitch all the way around the corset top, excluding the bottom. So this is going to be the use for our arm piece that we cut off earlier from the shirt. Since it's long enough, I'm going to be using it to make our straps and our bias tape binding along the bottom. So I'm just cutting the shirt open from the seam under the arm. And then I'm using my rotary blade to cut even strips. You can do this with fabric scissors. I just found the rotary blade a lot quicker. I cut a straight line down the center where you saw the fold was on the sleeve, and then I'm cutting 2 1-inch strips. These were more than long enough. They actually ended up being too long, but I'm cutting 2 1-inch strips, and then I'm going to be cutting 1 to 2 2-inch strips for the binding. So the 1-inch strips are going to be used for your spaghetti straps, and we're going to, I didn't end up getting any footage of it, but we're going to do the same process that we use for the bias tape along the bottom, where you fold it over into itself and iron it down, and then fold it again, and we stitch down the center of that. So what I've done is I've created my straps. They were a 1-inch strip of fabric, which I folded over, like you saw, similar technique to like you saw in the first corset tutorial. And then I wedged them in between my fabric, pinned them there, and then I sewed just over top regularly while I was sewing the 2 pattern pieces together. And now I'm going to flip them. It's more simple than the other one because you can just flip them from the straps. I'm actually really happy with how that turned out. So we're just going to give this a nice press, and then we'll move on to our making our boning channels, or like our zip tie channels. So here I'm going to start adding our top stitching as I discussed in the first tutorial. It's pretty simple. It's just a straight stitch as close to the edge as you can get. It just helps keep the fabric laying flat, and I think it gives it a nice professional finish. I've laid out all of the zip ties where I want them to go. They're actually a lot thinner than I was expecting when I ordered them, but I think that's okay. I'll just use a few more. So what we need to do is measure the size, the width of our zip tie. It's about 1/2 centimeter, so very small. So we're gonna make our channels 1/2 centimeter wide. Might be slightly challenging, but I'll place them where I want them to go, which is like in this kind of order, and then I'm going to just have to measure, use my ruler, and then stitch the channels. So for the zip ties, you're gonna have to cut off that piece at the top, like the bumpy piece at the top, and then maybe trim off the bottom so it's nice and square. And then I would recommend either using a lighter to kind of melt the plastic, but be really careful to not burn yourself, or use a file, which is really simple, just a nail file, to file down the edges so they don't pierce through your fabric. Also, if I didn't explain it well enough earlier, the zip tie channels are just, you'll just use a straight stitch and you're just stitching on top of your fabric, two next to each other, so it creates like a bit of a tunnel for you to slip your zip tie into. So my boning is in. I just slipped them in through my channels right here, you can see them. I ended up doing 4 channels in the front and 2 on each side, 1 underneath the armpit section, and then 1 at the back panel, just because my zip tie is really small, but it's all up to the look that you want, the structure that you want, so you can kind of decide what you would like. Next, I'm going to be making the binding for the bottom and adding that on, and I'll try to show that in as much detail as possible. So here I'm using my bias tape maker, which I explained kind of in the last video, but it's just 2 squares. One of them is 2 inches, which is the size of my fabric, and then one of them is 1 inch, which is the size that I want it to be after both sides are folded over. And it just makes this process a bit easier, and it kind of keeps it in place while I'm ironing. So as you see, I'm just going to feed it all through and iron it down. And then I lay it flat and I pin down the right side of the bias tape to the lining part of my corset top, and I'm gonna use a straight stitch along the bottom of that. Be careful not to hit your zip ties, and then what you do is you fold over the bottom, and that fold that we made earlier is going to create a nice finish, and then we're going to top stitch the bottom. Here I'm using my loops that I made, similar process to making your straps. I think they're about 2.5 inches. I felt like that was appropriate, and then we wedged them into the back of our corset top. I just unpicked the back top stitching, and then I do a straight stitch along there. So after trying things on, unfortunately it was a little bit too big. I hadn't taken into consideration the stretch in the material, so it's definitely something to look out for when you are picking out the material that you want to work with or the top that you want to work with, and just making adjustments. And also my straps were slightly, well, they were very big. So right now the straps are at 12 inches, and so I'll see how that goes. And hopefully all of the adjustments help in the fit. What I had to do to adjust my fit was unpick all of my seams, take out my loops, and I folded back the excess material. I decided to keep it instead of cutting it because it might give me some more reinforcement for where the loops are. And I also had to unpick the binding at the bottom and then redo that. So it was my least favorite thing to do when sewing is unpicking seams, but Otherwise, I couldn't have done the adjustment in a clean way. And here I'm measuring up my ribbon to lace up the back of my top. This ended up being about 68 inches in the end. And now I can show you the final product. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching and sticking it out with me. I'm really happy with the final product of this upcycled corset top. I hope this was as informative as possible. If you liked this video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed to my channel, and I can bring you guys more content. Please comment if there's anything that you would like to see, and please enjoy my awkward attempt at modeling here. Thanks for watching, guys.